Gary, can you hear me?
Yes, no.
Okay, great. So, okay, so I think we should start now. I'm sorry for the delay.
Okay, don't worry. But wait, Heiko, the
Yes.
sound, is the
Yes.
sound okay? Because I'm getting a buzz.
I think in the room people can hear you quite well. You cannot hear me well?
It just, there's a buzz. If I'm not getting the feedback there, that's fine.
Okay, no, here you sound very well.
Okay.
Okay, so I just want to quickly introduce Gary. I guess most of you know Mr. or Professor Gary L. Francione. He's a professor for law at Rutgers University. He is probably one of the people that most would associate with the term abolitionism. He's well known throughout the animal rights protection movement for his criticism of animal welfare and regulation and the property status of non-human animals, and especially for his abolitionist theory. Today, Gary is going to give us a presentation which has a title, The Appropriation of Abolition and Animal Rights by Regulationists. He's going to basically talk about how regulationists are nowadays attempting to appropriate the term abolitionism or abolitionist in exactly the same way that they did with the animal rights term in the 1990s. So Gary's going to give a presentation of roughly 30-35 minutes, and after that we're going to have some time that people can come up and ask questions. So please hold your questions back until the presentation is over, and then there's going to be about 20-25 minutes that questions can be asked. So please welcome Mr. Professor Francione.
Hello. Hi, thank you very much for having me at the conference. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm in the middle of my semester and I've got a lot of teaching responsibilities this semester, so I couldn't do it. But in any event, what I would like to do today is talk about what abolition means, because abolition is a term which, I mean, obviously anyone can use it, and as a result, you know, you have people use it who believe that we ought to abolish all animal exploitation. You have it used by people who think that we should abolish some animal exploitation, and we have some people who think that abolition means abolishing the worst abuses of animal use. So they say, well, I'm an abolitionist, but I want to get rid of factory farming, or I'm an abolitionist and I want to get rid of certain forms of animal use, but not all forms of animal use. And then you have people who say that we ought to get rid of all animal use. I am in that third category that I've just described. But what's happening is right now is exactly what happened in the 1990s, the late 1980s and 1990s with the term animal rights. That is, you had people, you know, animal rights, although I have to say when it first started being used in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it wasn't really clear. We weren't really clear about what it meant. But we knew that it meant something different from animal welfare and animal welfare reform, because it was emerging from that. It was an idea that sort of rejected that paradigm, but we weren't exactly sure what it meant. But as things went on, it became clear that that animal rights meant we could not justify animal exploitation at all. And the problem is that it very, very quickly, not from the beginning, but very quickly, it became a theory in opposition to animal welfare regulation. And what happened was that people who were in favor of animal welfare reform said, well, I'm an animal rights person. I just think we ought to use animal welfare regulation to get to the animal rights position. That is, animal welfare ought to be the means to the ends of animal rights. And those of us who considered ourselves animal rights people in a different sense said, no, the whole point of the animal rights movement is to reject regulation and to figure out means which are consistent with the end of recognizing that animals have inherent moral value, and that we can't justify using them. So in any event, you had that appropriation in the 1990s, so that now animal rights is a meaningless term. Now you have animal exploiters talking about animal rights. You have veal producers talking about how they support animal rights. And this means the concept has become meaningless because it's now appropriated by exploiters. And the same thing is happening with abolition to some degree. And there's really nothing you can do about it except trying to keep on reinforcing the idea of what it means. But at least what I think it means. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the abolitionist approach to animal rights as I've developed it, keeping in mind that there are other people who use abolition in a different way. I just disagree with that. And the theory that I have developed is a theory which is in a primary opposition to the theory that Peter Singer articulates. Peter Singer is a utilitarian. He doesn't believe in moral rights. For him, what is right or wrong is dependent on consequences. So he doesn't, and he also takes the position we'll talk about in a little while about the fact that most animals, as far as Singer is concerned, don't have an interest in continuing to live. So that killing them per se is not necessarily a harm, depending on how you do it. But the issue for Singer is reducing suffering. And so Singer focuses on treatment. He doesn't really focus on use that much, and except insofar as he thinks that use is a good way to talk about reducing suffering. But he doesn't say that veganism is an unequivocal or non-negotiable moral baseline. He basically talks about treatment issues. He supports conventional welfare reform. He himself talks about being a flexitarian and things like that. So my view is very, very different from that. My view is deontological in the sense it rests on moral notions that say that there are certain things we can't justify doing irrespective of consequences. So with that in mind, let me talk a little bit about the abolitionist approach to animal rights. The first and most important characteristic of the theory is that it rejects animal use altogether. And the theoretical basis is this, that if we think about various forms of discrimination, I mean, obviously all discrimination is bad, but chattel slavery is qualitatively different from just about everything else. Why? The reason that chattel slavery, which unfortunately still exists in the world in great numbers, there are a lot of human beings who are still enslaved, but nobody defends it anymore, and they haven't for a long time. Nobody tries to say, oh, well, slavery's okay. Where it's found, it is condemned. Whether we do anything effective about eliminating it is a different question, but nobody defends it. And so we have a situation where chattel slavery is regarded as qualitatively different from other forms of exploitation, because if a human being is a chattel slave, then the human being only has economic value, has no inherent or intrinsic value, but only has extrinsic or external value. And in that case, somebody else, the owner of the human being, can value that human's fundamental interests and life at zero, and basically negate the moral personhood of the slave. This is why we see slavery as chattel slavery as a really problematic thing, because basically it involves human beings having value that can be zero, depending on how the owner of the slave values that slave. This is what happens with all animals. Animals are property, okay? They are chattel property. They have no intrinsic or inherent value. They only have extrinsic or external value. We can value them. We buy them. We sell them. There are markets that trade cattle futures and we trade them on the futures markets. We buy them at stores. We buy them at pet stores. They are things. They have no value other than the value that we accord them. Even though they value their lives, even if we don't value their lives, they don't get any say about the value of their lives. We get the exclusive say. So what I argue in my work is that how can we justify saying that no human being, irrespective of the particular characteristics of that human being, how can we justify saying that no human being ought to be a slave, even if the person is not intelligent or not beautiful or not, whatever? We don't say, well, it's all right to enslave unintelligent people or unattractive people or whatever. We say slavery is bad. Again, there is slavery, but we don't defend it. We say it is bad. We say that slavery is wrong. Chattel slavery is morally wrong. Every human being has a pre-legal, basic moral right not to be treated exclusively as a means to the ends of another. And so the question becomes, and we recognize that's the minimum that you need to be a member of the moral community. If you're going to have moral value at all, you cannot be a slave. Once you're a slave, you have no moral value, okay? And so the question becomes, why do we not accord this right, this pre-legal basic moral right, to non-human animals? And the answer is we have no good answer. Whatever characteristic or defect we think that they have that justifies our treating them as things, some group of humans has that defect or that characteristic, but we would never think about treating them as slaves and saying, oh, okay, it's all right to treat mentally disabled people as slaves or whatever. I mean, most of us would find that obscene, and for good reason. And so the question becomes, why do we think it's okay to treat animals as chattel property? And the answer is we have no good answer. So if we regard animals as having moral value, the one thing we have to be clear about is we cannot treat them. We cannot treat them as chattel. We cannot treat them as property. The problem is, once we say that they have a fundamental right not to be treated as property, institutional exploitation has to end. It's not a question of treating them humanely. It's a question of you can't justify institutionalized exploitation at all. It doesn't matter how nicely you treat them. You cannot. It doesn't matter how nicely you treated the slaves. There were some slave owners who were worse than other slave owners, but slavery is bad no matter how you look at it. And so, yes, it's obviously better to inflict less harm than more harm, but no animal use can be justified if animals have this one basic moral pre-legal right not to be treated exclusively as property. And so that's really, in a nutshell, what I've expressed in my various writings about, and I've discussed it from different angles as well, and I've talked about I've talked about this from other directions. But basically, this is a nutshell of the argument. Let me just look at my notes. Okay. A second. So first of all, the first point is the abolitionist approach to animal rights says you cannot justify using animals at all. You can't justify using them for food, for clothing, for entertainment, for biomedical research, for anything. You can't justify using them as service dog. You can't justify using them to provide, quote, service to human beings. You just can't justify using them. And it actually means, if we respected this one right not to be treated as property, and again, we're not talking about a legal right. We're talking about a moral right, the recognition of a moral right. If we recognize that moral right, we would end domestication. Domestication itself is a violation of the fundamental right not to be treated exclusively as a means to the ends of another, because domestication basically results in a permanent vulnerability and dependence on humans, which is problematic. A second aspect of the abolitionist approach to animal rights is we reject the welfare regulation, this idea that we can make animal exploitation more humane. I mean, there are theoretical dimensions of this. That is, if animal exploitation cannot be morally justified, we ought not to be promoting humane exploitation as justifiable, because if it's wrong, and we ought not to be promoting more humane versions of it. Just like we think rape is wrong, and we would never say, now obviously there are some rapes that are more brutal and violent than other rapes, and obviously it's better to inflict less harm rather than more harm, but we don't walk around saying, gee, people ought to rape in a more gentle way. If it's wrong, you say it shouldn't happen at all. So that's the theoretical thing. But there are practical problems with animal welfare, like the big one being it doesn't work. We've had animal welfare as a strong social ethic for about 200 years now, and we're exploiting more animals now than ever before in human history in more horrific ways. Animal welfare doesn't work, and it can't work. And the reason why it can't work is because animals are property. Go back to point one. Animals are property. They only have an economic value. We only can, as a matter of economics, the only time we can really protect their interests is if we get an economic benefit from doing so. There has to be some sort of benefit. It's usually an economic benefit that we get because it costs money to protect their interests. And if you look at the history of animal welfare reform, what you see is, by and large, animal welfare reforms do very little for animals. And what they actually do is end up making animal exploitation more economically efficient. Case in point that you can look at in Europe, for example, is the veal crate. The veal crate is basically being phased out in most places. Why? Is it because we really have moral concern about animals? And the answer is, well, that was the articulated concern of some people, but the producers recognize one thing, and that is if you have a calf in a chute tethered by the neck, that calf suffers an enormous amount of stress, has no social interaction with other calves. Cows are very social animals, and so when you keep them in these crates, they become ill. That causes veterinary that causes incurring veterinary costs. If you take them out of the veal chute and you put them in a small social unit where they don't have much more space, but where they're able to interact with other calves, the veterinary costs actually go down. It's an economically efficient thing to do. And if you look at most of the campaigns that are being promoted by animal welfare groups in the United States and Europe, most of those reforms are things that are not going to drive the price up so that demand would come down, but they're things which actually don't ever exceed what we call the price elasticity. So basically, even if the price rises a bit, it's not going to affect demand because it doesn't leave the zone of elasticity, by which I mean elasticities have to do with how much you can raise a price before it will affect in any significant way demand. And so, even if an enriched battery egg costs 1 euro cent more than a conventional battery egg, that's not. And even if the retail of those eggs goes up to some degree, it's not going to cause any sort of significant decrease in demand for the eggs. And we see this. I was just reading something about European demand for eggs, and they're basically saying even with these changes, the demand is basically not really being affected. But animal welfare reform doesn't work. It doesn't work because it can't work, because it runs slam bang against this thing called economics. And you cannot really, unless the population is willing to pay a significantly increased price for animal products, then you can't really significantly change the way that you're raising the animals, because it will cause the price to go up, and that will affect demand and consumers. If the consumers are not ready to deal with that, then it's not going to ever work. And so animal welfare reform doesn't work. Actually, what I think it's safe to say that animal welfare reform does one thing very well. It makes people feel better about continuing to exploit animals. That is absolutely clear. You can see that in anything that you look at these days. That is, we are right now dealing with something that I call the happy exploitation movement. It is the state of affairs in the United States, in Western Europe, in South America, all over the place. It's happy exploitation. It's this idea of we've got to have cage-free eggs and free-range eggs and crate-free pork and happy this and happy that. And what does this do? It has one significant impact. It doesn't do a hell of a lot for the animals, I mean, most of these reforms don't do much anyway. They're phased in. They're phased in over a period of 8 million years anyway. So, I mean, it's not that they're doing anything for animals today. And even if they were implemented today, they wouldn't do a hell of a lot. But what they do is they make people feel more comfortable about exploiting animals. And what you're seeing now is a shift away. Is this happy exploitation movement, this flexitarian movement, this vegan before 6 movement, this meatless Monday. All of these sorts of things are just making people feel more comfortable about animal exploitation. Animal welfare doesn't work, and a very important point to keep in mind. If we had a vegan movement, and if we had an abolitionist vegan movement that said no means no, we cannot justify exploiting any animals, we can't justify using any animals as our property, we have to stop it, we have to stop domestication, we cannot justify eating animals at all, or wearing them or using them. If we had that position, which in the beginning would appear to be very radical, but if we got that social discussion going, what would happen is exploiters would respond the same way they're responding now. That is, they would try to assure the public that things weren't really all that bad, and they would make these same welfare reforms, these same economically insignificant and maybe even to them beneficial welfare reforms, so that they could assure the public and keep the public from engaging the discussion about use. So you'd get these animal welfare reforms anyway, even if you didn't have every organization from PETA to HSUS to, Viva, to all of these groups in the United States and Europe, Farm Sanctuary, Mercy for Animals, you have them all promoting happy exploitation. You wouldn't need, it's going to happen whether they're promoting it or not. If we had a movement with integrity, a movement that wasn't forming partnerships with exploiters, we would be able to get those. To the extent that you're worried about losing the benefits of those welfare reforms, you'd get them anyway. Okay, I'm running out of time. The third point is veganism. The abolitionist perspective promotes veganism as an absolute non-negotiable baseline. No eating, no wearing, no using. It's not a question of happy this, happy that. It's a question of, no, I don't really care how well you treat them. I don't care, whether you have chickens in the backyard. You shouldn't be eating eggs. At least I take the position we cannot justify consuming any animal products whatsoever, and that our primary social activism. One of the things I find very bizarre is the number of animal people I meet who are not vegans. I do not understand that. I do not believe you can. To say that you are an animal rights person or whatever you want to say, and that you're not a vegan, is incoherent in my view. Just as if you were, in 1840 in the United States, and you said, I'm really opposed to slavery, but I own them, I would have found that a very peculiar thing for you to say. And I don't see a distinction between flesh and other animal products. There's as much suffering and death in a glass of milk as there is in a pound of steak. I do not accept vegetarianism as a coherent moral position. I don't promote vegetarianism. I basically say veganism. That's the position I think. That's the only position I believe that's morally justifiable. And so what I believe is that on an individual level, we are obligated to be vegans, and what our social activism ought to be primarily focused on promoting veganism and teaching about veganism and using creative, nonviolent ways of teaching about veganism. Doesn't mean, I would love to see, somebody asked me the other day, wouldn't you love to see a demonstration of millions of people in Washington, D.C. Demanding veganism? And the answer is, yeah, I'd love it. I think that'd be great. The problem is if you have an event like that, you're going to get a lot of people who are not vegans, who are coming, who are promoting welfare reform, who are promoting vegetarianism, who are promoting, let's get rid of this particular product, or let's get rid of fur or whatever, and it becomes a welfarist single issue campaign demonstration. Nothing would make me happier than a very large, very clearly stated demonstration on behalf of veganism. And so I think we ought to be engaging in boycotts. We ought to be engaging in all sorts of creative, nonviolent action to educate people about veganism. And you know what, people? I know a lot of folks say to me, well, but that's such a radical idea. Bottom line is, I do this every day of my life. I talk to groups every day of my life, and it ain't that radical. I mean, I don't necessarily talk philosophy to them. I will start off by saying, do you think dogfighting? We had a very big case involving a football player in the United States. People were very upset because this guy was engaged in dogfighting. And so I start off a lecture by saying, why do you think what this guy did was wrong? The response I get is, well, because, you can't justify suffering, imposing suffering just because you get pleasure out of it. Once you get people to see that, and you know what, most human beings, whether they have a philosophy degree or whether they have, a college education or whether they're just, whether they have a grammar school education, people understand that. Let's not assume that people are idiots. They're not. They understand that. They understand that it's that we can't. Most people share the moral intuition that the infliction of suffering and death on a sentient being requires some sort of justification, and pleasure isn't a good justification. But that's the only justification we have for eating them, for wearing them, for using them in most contexts. That's the only justification we have. So this really isn't all that hard. It's not rocket science. As a matter of fact, it's more difficult to persuade a group of quote animal people about veganism as a moral baseline than it is to convince members of the general public. I talk to them every day of my life. I talk to students who aren't animal people every day of my life. And you know what? This idea can get out, and it's spreading. I mean, the one thing that's clear to me is that there's a grassroots movement emerging, an abolitionist movement. It's emerging all over the place. But it's grassroots. It's not the corporate welfare movement. It's not connected with the large organizations. And these ideas are spreading. Okay, I'm going to skip some stuff. Okay. A couple of points. The abolitionist approach stays away from this idea that great apes and non-human, that elephants and dolphins and all these, these animals that are supposed to have human-like intelligence somehow matter more than dogs or fish or chickens, or whatever. The bottom line is, it's not intelligence that matters for purposes of having this pre-legal, basic moral right not to be treated exclusively as a means to the ends of another. It's not intelligence, it's sentience. Is the being perceptually aware? Is the being subjectively aware? If the being is subjectively aware, then that's the only cognitive activity that is necessary to justify, to say that we cannot justify treating that being as a thing, okay? I'm very concerned about this idea. Look, I had a chapter in the Grade A Project in 1992. And even then, my ideas were not as clear as they are now. But I talked about sentience there too. But nevertheless, I have a chapter in a book that talks about non-human great apes being morally more valuable than other animals. I don't believe that, and I think we need to stay away from this idea that dolphins matter more, elephants matter more, non-human great apes matter more. They don't. As far as I'm concerned, an elephant may weigh more than a mouse, but not morally. We cannot justify exploiting either of them. And you know what? We see this in the human context. I mean, you can have a human being who's very intelligent and a human being who's severely mentally disabled. And you can say, all right, well, is there a difference? And the answer is yeah. And the difference may matter. I mean, it may be the case that if the person is so severely mentally disabled, you may not give that person a driving, a license to drive an automobile because the person is not capable of observing road rules and things like that. But for purposes, if the question is, which do we use in a painful biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor, the really intelligent person or the person who's severely mentally disabled? The answer is you don't use either of them. For purposes of being treated as a resource, they're equal. Even though there are differences, they're equal. So there are differences between a chimpanzee and a mouse. Certainly there are differences, but we shouldn't be using either of them in any sort of instrumental way. This is a key difference I have with Singer. Singer's a utilitarian. He's basically in the mode of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who believe that animals matter, but that different from us and that they're not self-aware. And because they're not self-aware, they don't care if we use them. They only care about how we treat them. The cow doesn't care that we kill and eat her. She just cares about how we treat her while she's alive and how we kill her. I think that's nonsense. I think that that's actually speciesism. I think what that's doing is linking self-awareness for moral purposes to a human-like conception of self-awareness. And I don't think that you can justify that. And I reject that. I think I really think that idea has gotten into the movement. I mean, I think Singer's idea and Bentham's idea, Mill's idea about the fact that animals matter in terms of their suffering, but they don't matter in terms of use because they're different from us cognitively, and they don't have an interest in their lives. They don't have an interest in continuing to live, as it were. I think that is what is influencing this whole happy exploitation movement, and has all of these groups focused on treatment. I mean, they're basically, you can't really focus on treatment and not be coming out very squarely against use unless you believe that animals have a different moral value from humans. And I believe that idea is pervasive in the movement. As a matter of fact, I did a debate book in 2010 with Professor Robert Garner from the University of Leicester. It's called The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation. And Garner made the point, he said that he thought that I was the only theorist who believed that human life and non-human life had equal moral value for purposes of treating beings as resources, and that may in fact be the case, because certainly Singer doesn't take that view, doesn't agree with me there, and Reagan's a little more unclear, but in any event, I think that that's a sad comment that the modern movement has incorporated this speciesist idea that the cow doesn't care that we kill and eat her. She just cares about how we treat her and how we kill her. I think that's crazy. Two more points, and then I will open it up for questions. The abolitionist approach has a very, very clear position on human rights. I mean, basically, speciesism is wrong because it's like racism, sexism, heterosexism, and other forms of discrimination. And that means we have a position on racism, sexism, heterosexism, and all those sorts of things. And it's that they're bad. You can't say, it doesn't make any sense to say that speciesism is bad, but, we don't have a position on racism or, sexism. That may be okay if it helps animals. It's something that drives me crazy, is this idea. I mean, the modern animal movement is relentlessly sexist. Now, I accept that the society is relentlessly sexist, but that doesn't mean we should be promoting sexism. I mean, the bottom line is, as long as we're treating women like meat, we're going to be treating, animals like meat, and it's never going to change. But the bottom line is that I think that we need to really embrace a very broad and a very progressive theory of human rights, that we can't justify any sort of exploitation, and that we should never use racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, whatever, as a means to educate people about animals. That's not right. My final point is, I view the animal rights movement and the abolitionist perspective as an extension of the peace movement. I reject violence. I embrace a sort of a Gandhian sense of nonviolence. I'm very happy to have people engage in nonviolent, I think that people have the right to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and things like that. Where I have a problem is in the idea of ever advocating violence, any sort of personal violence. The idea that we can inflict violence or harm animal exploiters. The problem with that is everybody's an animal exploiter. So if you say, well, this guy is a vivisector and he's using 60, dogs a year in experiments, so therefore it's all right to engage in actions which can be construed as, or which are violent against this person. That means if your mother is not a vegan and she's eating chicken and she eats chicken a couple times a week, she's responsible for more than 60 deaths a year. So what are we talking about here? We live in a world where people exploit animals all the time. The levels of confusion are so profound. You have people who consider themselves, quote, animal people who are not vegan, right? So, I mean, everybody participates in animal exploitation, and those of us who aren't vegan are doing it directly. And frankly, So the idea, so if it's all right to inflict violence against the vivisector, it's all right to inflict violence on anybody who's an animal exploiter, and that just doesn't make sense. I mean, really, we're never going to get anywhere with thinking about the issue that way. We've got to shift the paradigm. We've got to shift the paradigm away from property and toward personhood. We've got to get the social discussion going. I'll leave you with one final thought. Some research people at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York have done a study of various social movements, and they say what you need is 10% of a population that is firmly committed to an idea. And if you're firmly committed to that idea, that idea spreads. If 10% of the population is firmly committed to the idea spreads, and you get a different social discussion. Right now, we don't have a social discussion about abolishing animal use. Right now, we have a discussion about how we can make animal exploitation more humane. That's never going to go in a good direction. All it's going to do is make people feel more comfortable about exploiting animals. And if we want if we want the discussion, let's change the discussion. The way we change the discussion, everybody should go vegan. And what we should do every day of our lives, we should never go to bed at night without having talked to at least one other person about veganism. Let's, in every context in which we find ourselves, let's get ourselves to that 10%. Let's change that conversation. Let's start talking about use. Let's stop talking about happy exploitation. Let's stop all of the nonsense. Let's talk about justice for animals, and let's start talking about the fact that we all believe, everybody believes, animal person, non-animal person, we all believe that we have no business, we cannot morally justify inflicting unnecessary suffering and death on animals. Let's get people to see what that means. And what that means is go vegan. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have about 15 to 20 minutes now. Oh, now we have an echo.
I don't. I mean, it sounds the way.
I heard an echo. Okay, it's gone now. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes now that we can ask questions. It would be nice if anybody who would like to ask a question come up here. So Professor Francione can also see you. There's a webcam, so he can also basically look into the room. So if there's any questions, could you please come up here and pose them right here?
Okay, thank you very much for your speech. I have 2 questions about the abolitionist approach. First of all, your focus is on the basic right not to be used as property or merely as a means. Now that is, for us, that's a negative duty, so it means we should not do something with others. What about positive duties? Duty to help someone. And I mean, for example, in the wild, there is a lot highly underestimated suffering in the wild. To what extent do we have a duty to help the suffering in the wild? And a little bit related to this question is the problem of predation. So the lion eating the zebra. The lion is, in my opinion, using the zebra as merely a means. Now you can say, okay, for the lion it's necessary, but that reply also goes for the forced organ transplantation, so that does not work. You can say that the lion has no moral agency, but then I would say, yeah, if the lion is more intelligent to understand moral rights, then we should say to him that he's no longer allowed to eat meat. So what would your response be if we have, like, for example, dolphins, they have a proto-morality. If they become a little bit more intelligent, they will perhaps understand ethics. Dolphins, they eat sentient beings, they eat a lot of fish. So this is a moral problem if we only focus on the basic right not to be used as merely means.
Okay, let me just say, because these sorts of questions, I could spend a half an hour discussing these things, and I can't. So let me give you a quick answer. Yes, my theory is primarily a theory of negative rights, and you know what? I don't worry about the positive rights, and I'll tell you why. We are killing 57 billion land animals a year for food. We are killing about 1 trillion sea animals a year for food. If we accepted the negative right that I talk about, we would stop doing it. And we would have a very different world, and we'd be able to figure out all of these other dilemmas a whole lot easier if in that context. So I do not, when you say, well, what about predation? I don't really think we should interfere, frankly. I mean, look, I'm interested in talking about it, but I mean, to call that is academic, in my judgment. That is academic in the worst sense of the word, because while we're all busy eating them, and while we're all busy not promoting veganism, people say, well, let's talk about whether or not it's all right for the lion to eat the zebra. Look, I don't know whether a lion makes a moral decision before the lion eats the zebra. I have no idea. And I don't really care how intelligent dolphins are. I really, it's hard for me to understand how you can have propositional attitudes. I mean, clearly they're very cognitively sophisticated, but you know what? I don't really understand how a dolphin thinks. Neither does anybody else. So the idea that, well, if they're intelligent, they might be able to. I don't think they have propositional attitudes the same way we have propositional attitudes. But you know what? I don't care. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that we stop the massive destruction of animal life every day because for our palate pleasure and for our fashion sense and for all of that sort of stuff. And I mean, I live in a rural environment, and sometimes, during the winter, I buy food and I put it out for the deer, and I'm always thinking, is this a good idea? Because, I mean, I'm interfering with it, but I mean, I sort of, I have two feelings, I end up buying the food and I end up putting it out there, and I figure, well, if I try to do the best I can. I try to help where I can, if I saw an animal harming another animal, I would probably intervene. Would that be the right thing to do? I'm not 100% sure. There are questions, I mean, it's like people always ask me, what about cats? If you have a cat and you have to feed the cat meat, I said, look, I really wish that was the only problem in the world I have to deal with. I mean, most of the time, the people who ask me that are not vegans themselves. So they say, oh, well, what about vegan cat? I have a cat. I can't feed the cat vegan. And I always say to that person, are you a vegan? 85% of the time people say no. And I say, well, then why are we wasting time? You could be a vegan. Why are we wasting time talking about your cat? You don't take it seriously. So like, why are we like talking about your cat? And so, the idea of about lions eating zebras, I don't know whether they make moral decisions. I do. You do. And we have to make the moral decision. And so the idea, I'm going to be having having a conference at Rutgers University in the spring, focused around whether we should have, Will Keimlicka, who wrote Zoopolis, and Sue Donaldson are going to be coming, and we're going to be having Gary Steiner will be there, and David Nybert will be there, and we're going to be having a discussion about, Will's view of Will makes similar comments to you. He says, well, it's a negative theory. We need to have a positive theory. And then Will argues that, well, people will never accept a negative theory, but they might accept a positive theory. And the answer is, if they don't accept the negative theory, it's really not of interest to me. If we're still eating them, then everything else is sort of an uninteresting question.
So, another question?
Hi, Gary. My name's Darren.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm all right.
Okay. I just wanted to ask you a bit more about. Oh, sorry, yeah, because I have to look into the camera. You see me now?
I could see you when you were
Just
sitting
wanna
down.
sat down,
Go ahead,
yeah.
sit down.
Yeah,
Sit down,
we're just
relax.
following orders, man. You know how we have to follow orders now and again. But no, the question of violence, I think there's a lot more to violence than I think I don't think you cover it in 2 or 3 minutes. The question of self-defense and violence. Because these people who engage in acts of non-violent acts of rescue and things like that, for example. Basically, it's like an act of self-defense, It's like you're defending your missus or your own animals to some extent. So I think there's a lot more to the question of violence. And I'm a Dr. Steve Best supporter as well, and I'm campaigning for him to get this ban lifted, this ban, because a lot of people, when you mention Dr. Best, they assume violence straight away. You know, this labeling and all this terrorist laws that they're using and all that lot. And the man's not a violent man. You know, he's not a violent man. He don't preach violence, but he gets put into that category because I think there's a significant difference, you know, between the sentient beings of an animal and what else, you know, and a non-sentient being. You know, there's a significant difference there. You can't do violence to an.
Can I interrupt you?
And one last thing.
I'm not talking about any individual person. I'm not criticizing any particular person.
Okay, so basically, you know, I'm just saying I think there's a bit more to the subject of violence, you know, and but like I mean, Uganda, for example, as well. I know that you support civil disobedience. I'm not sure if you're a strong supporter of civil disobedience, but I know there were a case where he did a salt march and he broke the law. And we were speaking. One of the girls were doing a talk earlier on yesterday, and I asked that same question: if the law's not effective, you know, where do we stand on breaking it? Is that okay? You know, and where do you stand on us breaking the law like how Gandhi did?
Okay. Let me say what I said before. If you live in a society, we're not living in a society where we're not living in 1840 in America, where you've got a lot of people who are opposed to race-based slavery and some people who own, actually there were a relatively few number of people who actually owned slaves. And there was an enormous opposition to race-based slavery in the United States and in Britain and other places. So we're not dealing with that sort of situation where you've got some people who are doing something, but most people aren't, and where there's a significant opposition to the activity. And what I'm saying is that we are dealing with a qualitatively different situation. So we're dealing with a situation where a lot of people who advocate, you know, I mean, I've had discussions with people who aren't even vegan who talk about animal liberation and they talk about rescuing animals from laboratories. I find that laughable. I mean, you're not a vegan, but you think it's okay to, you know, I mean, that just boggles my mind. But the bottom line is that we are. How do you deal with this as a coherent concept in a society in which 98% of the people are actively involved in animal exploitation? So if you want to say that it's all right to inflict violence on a vivisector who kills 60 dogs a year, you have to take the position that it's all right to inflict violence on your mother if she eats chicken. Now, if you want to take that position, at least I don't like violence. I mean, I basically am a nonviolent person. I very much favor the theory of nonviolence for lots of different reasons, moral and practical. But if at least if you're going to take that position, you're being consistent. But this idea that it's only certain people who are engaging in exploitation, in my mind, is just absolute incoherence. Now, when you talk about wanting to rescue animals, you know, I always find this very, I'd love to see every lab emptied. I'd love to see every animal out of every cage. But you know what? I don't draw a line between the ones who are in laboratories and the ones who are sitting in hideous shelters, we call them shelters, and these hideous holes, hell holes all over the place. Go and adopt. You know what? I got 5 rescued dogs in this house, okay? You know, and they all came from horrible, all except one, came from really horrible circumstances, and that one came from a slightly horrible circumstance. But they all come from horrible circumstances. Go and rescue, you know, I mean, but then you've got a commitment, right? You know, you got a commitment. You got to take care of them. But, I mean, this idea that, you know, I mean, I don't understand. I have to tell you, I really just don't understand why anybody thinks that this is the solution to the problem. And let me just tell you that in several circumstances, I have interposed myself between people who are abusing animals, and you know, and non-violently interposed myself, and I've been assaulted. Okay, so I mean, you know, I'm willing to do that when I need to, but I don't believe in engaging in violence. And I also want to say, I wasn't talking about any particular person. I don't understand. I mean, you know, you want to talk about individual people, that's fine. I'm talking about concepts.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. And I just want to know briefly, why you put Meatless Monday and welfarist movement in the same place when you're talking about against this?
Because I think that it's crazy to promote the idea that there's a moral distinction between flesh and other animal products. There isn't. You know, I frequently run into people who have been vegetarians for 20 years, and you know, until they get exposed to the abolitionist ideas, you know, then they go vegan, and they say no one's ever asked them. You know, I mean, they always thought vegetarianism was perfectly fine. We draw this artificial line between meat and other animal products. I don't. I think, I mean, you know, you want to have meatless, you want to have a day. I mean, I started this thing last week actually called Vegan Monday, Vegan Every Day. You want to have a day. I mean, I don't like the idea of saying that our moral obligations to animals are on particular days and we don't have them other days. My view is that we ought to be basically, you know, we ought to get away from all this gimmickry. It's all gimmickry, and these are all things which are lend themselves very, very nicely to the campaigns of large animal organizations. I think they're gimmicks. I don't think they work. I don't think they're changing anything, and they're not changing fundamental thinking. So if you want to have a day, have a Vegan Monday, but always make clear that it's vegan every day, that you're not saying that they should not be vegan on Tuesday. I think the whole Meatless Monday thing, promoting this incoherent distinction between flesh and other animal products, just doesn't make any sense. By the way, you know, if you eat primarily beef and pork, you stop eating the beef and pork and you start eating more eggs, you may actually be responsible for more deaths, because there are more deaths per 1,000 calories of eggs than there is of cows and pigs. So this idea that, well, we stop eating flesh and we eat eggs instead for our animal protein, you may be responsible for killing more animals. I don't think I don't think that we ought to look at it in terms of numbers. I just think in terms of this idea about vegetarianism being a coherent moral position. I don't think it is. Hello, hi, what's your name?
Hi, Gary. This is George, from Brazil. And I would...
George from Brazil.
That's me,
The George that I met in June.
The George, the one you talked to 2 months ago.
How are you?
How's it going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very well.
By the way, your book is already in the market in Brazil, just 2 days ago, so that you know, in case you didn't.
Introduction to Animal Rights?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I saw it.
Good.
I saw it, yeah.
Okay. So my question is, I never had the opportunity to ask you this, and you always talk about, focusing all energy in the movement, and how good of a use we make of our energy, talking about the right issues, and not talking about single themes. But I would like to know, how do you see, as far as energy use, when we are making partnerships with other movements or other causes in order to use that, if you will, as a means to achieve our cause, but it's actually, as Patrice put very clear today, they're intersectional, so we're actually bringing all causes to their objective. So is that an efficient use of energy, or do you see that as a deviation from our cause when we are building bridges with other movements, and perhaps in that instance using arguments that are not straightly focused on an animal rights issue, apparently?
I'm not saying that animal people ought to stop promoting veganism or stop focusing on animals, and they ought to focus. I'm saying that we, in our promotion of abolition or animal rights, we ought not to be using sexist imagery. We ought not to be using races. I mean, I get very upset when I see this stupidity about acting as though the Chinese are morally iniquitous because they eat dogs. I mean, nobody should be eating any animals, but the Chinese are no worse than anybody else, or the Romanians. Now the bad group du jour are the Romanians. They're bad. They're bad because they're killing dogs. Well, I got news for you. We kill 3.5 million of them here. So the Romanians are bad. The Chinese are bad. I don't believe in that. I think it's nonsense. But what I try to do when I talk to people from other social movements, because I do that quite a bit. So I'll talk to a feminist group, or to a gay rights group, and I always tell them, look, keep fighting for gay rights, keep fighting for women's rights, but you got to eat 3 times a day. You got to go buy clothes. You got to go buy shampoo. So when you eat vegan. When you buy clothes, don't buy leather, wool, fur. I don't draw a distinction. I think the anti-fur campaign, look, I've been in this for 32 years. I've been a vegan for 32 years, and I've been doing this work for 32 years. And you know, when I first got involved, the big issue was the anti-fur campaign. I never understood why fur was any different from wool or leather. And I stopped when I became a vegan, I stopped wearing all of them. And I've come to the conclusion that the only difference between fur and leather is if you walk up to somebody who wearing a leather coat and say some of the things that I have heard animal people say to women wearing fur, the person wearing the leather coat who may be a male may remove your teeth. And that's basically the primary distinction. But I do not see a distinction between, I mean, wool is horrible too. So my view is I always say to people, look, fight for women's rights, keep on fighting for children's rights or whatever it is you want to fight for. Fight the good, fight something, you know, oppose injustice. But while you do it, be vegan. Don't buy animal clothing. You know, I'm not interested in all animal people becoming, you know, spending their time in gay rights, the gay rights movement, or gay rights people becoming animal people. I'm interested in all of us seeing that all of this discrimination, racism, sexism, heterosexism, speciesism, ableism, classism, all this stuff is a form of violence. I am opposed to violence. I think we have to reject it all, and we have to be clear about that. And so I'm not suggesting that anybody ought to stop doing their animal stuff and start doing something else, or that people who are doing children's rights issues. I had somebody call me up the other day and say, you know, I'm doing children's rights work. How can I help animals more? I said, are you vegan? And she said, no. I said, go vegan. I said, that's the first thing you can do. And I said, you know, she said, should I start getting involved? And I said, there's really very little to get involved with in terms of these large organizations. Most of their campaigns are useless and counterproductive. The best thing to do is go vegan, and in your context, in your children's rights context, where you're talking to people who are interested about children's rights, why don't you try to explain to them about the relationship between animal rights and human rights, and why, if they care about children, they ought to care about non-humans, and why nobody would be campaigning for more gentle child abuse, why we shouldn't be focused on happy exploitation, and why veganism is the analog in the animal context of what the abolition of child abuse and pedophilia is in the children's context. So I'm not suggesting that we ought to sort of all become, you know, activists and everything. I just think we've got to be clear in terms of what our values are, in terms of everything we're doing.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of the session, so I would like to have time for one more question, but please keep it short. And Gary, can you also answer not too long, because we have a session coming up? So here's the last question.
Thank you for your talk. I really like the use argument. I think it's absolutely valid. As long as we have animals as property, they will be in trouble. But I think you are ignoring the situation a little bit we are in. For example, you say you would never oppose or you would never ask for a soft rape.
A what?
I would never ask for a soft or a non-cruel rape. But the thing is, if I go to the police now and I report a rape, they'll stop it. If I go to the police and report somebody is unnecessarily killing an animal in a slaughterhouse and I want to block this slaughterhouse, they'll arrest me, not the guy killing the animal. So my question is, going to Oskar Schindler, the guy behind Schindler's List, he also was in a society which was morally totally wrong, and if he had taken the abolitionist approach and said, well, racism is wrong, you should release all prisoners, he would have got killed, all the people would have got killed, and so isn't it smarter in this case to save the lives? Shouldn't we be as effective as possible in saving lives, even if that means not just being as straightforward as we like to be? And at this conference, we also heard Nick Cooney. So my second question is, he showed studies that we can save more lives by using certain approach, for example, asking to be vegetarian. And do you have any psychological studies that show that more lives are saved if you use a direct approach? Thank you.
Nick Cooney presented that at that conference I was at in June, and it's nonsense. I've asked Nick, I've asked Bruce Friedrich for these psychological studies. As a matter of fact, Bruce said, or Nick said, I don't remember which one, said that there were 1,000 studies that showed that participating in incremental measures make people more absolutist or whatever. It's nonsense. There are no studies. The one study that they all seem to be excited about is a study which says that there was not as much of an increase in animal consumption as they thought there would have been at a time in which there were welfare campaigns going on, and they made a correlation which they had no business making anyway, because there are all sorts of things going on, all sorts of discourse going on, to the extent that there was not an increase in consumption, that not as much of an increase in consumption as they thought there would be. You can no more correlate that with welfare campaigns than you can correlate it with the economy, than you can correlate it with abolitionist thinking, than you can correlate it with, anything. So I think that Nick Cooney is peddling some very, very poor science. But again, I understand why he's doing this, because Nick Cooney is a big promoter of cage-free eggs and happy exploitation. As far as your question about rape is concerned, I have news for you. Rape is epidemic. This idea that, oh, well, everybody's opposed to rape and it's a crime. The answer is, yeah, tell that to all the women who are raped. 1 in 4 women in this country, my country, 1 in 4 women will be a victim of rape or attempted rape. Rape is epidemic. Child abuse is epidemic. This idea that, these things are really not problems, the way animal exploitation is nonsense. Okay, it's absolute nonsense. Yeah, there are laws that supposedly prohibit rape, but tell that to all the women who get raped. Just tell them, okay? Because I think that they would probably find it to be news. As far as Schindler's concerned, as far as I know, Schindler didn't propose that we put color television. I guess they didn't have color televisions then, but he didn't promote putting televisions in concentration camps. What he tried to do was to help individual victims when he had the opportunity. He helped individual victims in a context in which that made sense. That made moral sense, and it was obviously the right thing to do. But to extrapolate from Schindler and to say what we ought to be doing is promoting happy exploitation because that's going to really deal with the problem now, or the sorts of things that Nick Cooney and Bruce Friedrich and my old friends at PETA, because I was once involved with PETA in the early 1980s, all of the stuff, all of this happy exploitation that they support, the partnerships that they support between institutional exploiters and animal advocates is, I think, pushing everything in the wrong direction.
Okay, so I'm very sorry. We should have planned a little bit more time for this session, but we have another session coming up, so unfortunately we have to come to a close. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
And thanks for taking the time. And if for some reason next year you cannot make it either, then we will definitely plan a longer session, because I think there's many questions still in the audience.
Next year I'll be there.
Okay, great.
All right. Take care.